This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in pretending that my graduate education was useful. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined once again by David Bentley Hart, devotee of a canine bodhisattva and Gnostic fabulist, author most recently of Roland and Moonlight, Kinagaya, Tradition and Apocalypse, an essay on the future of Christian belief, and You Are Gods. David, thanks for agreeing to do this yet again. As ever, it is a generous use both of your time and of your advertising energies.
Yeah, well, the latter is what I care about, I mean, my time, I'm willing to parcel it out for sufficient emoluments. I measure these things in 7-minute quanta. If I get a return of more than 15 cents per 7 minutes, I feel it's worth the effort.
Yeah, I think certainly that has to, statistically, I feel like that has to have happened over these conversations at this point.
I like to think so, yeah. To sell a few books, get 1 or 2 subscriptions to my Substack, that covers you,
Yeah, I changed my Substack payment situation to just say hey, if you want to buy me a pizza every now and again, thanks for it. But yes, so the talk I pitched to you today is on.
Does that include Hawaiian pizza, though?
Not normally, no.
Yeah, good. I just wanted to make sure there. I mean, pineapple on a pizza. It's not that I'm against it in principle. I'm just not sure that you can ever see the kingdom of God on those.
Anyway, my friends are big Hawaiian pizza people. I'm not, but I am a student of hospitality, so I try to practice.
It's one of those things where someone eats it, they like it once, and then become addicted to it and forget all the things that first drew them to pizza. It's sad. It's like the moment they added avocado to sushi. Now it's almost impossible to get sushi in the Western Hemisphere unpolluted by avocado. Again, I have nothing against avocado in its place, but it needs to know its place, which is not in sushi.
Which is not in sushi. I can agree with that.
A murky and jarringly incongruous effect on what should be something fresh and sharp and precise. So, and you have to blame the Californians, as you do for so much of what's wrong with the universe.
Yeah. No, I mean, for goodness sake, it's well, I won't go into what that land has produced. You know it well. But yeah. So today I pitched to you that we should talk about poetry. Poetry generally, but with the somewhat arbitrary and easily transgressed horror of poetry ranging from Homer and the Beatles all the way to the Beatles. So from antiquity to the present. But also by way of talking about poiesis in general.
As much as I love the Beatles, I'm not so sure that their lyrics were necessarily what distinguished them. The gift for melody, undeniable, and every once in a while there are songs like "Girl" or Eleanor Rigby with really very good lyrics, but there are other 20th century figures you could have chosen.
We'll just say generally 20th century music, because I assume that you probably feel, as I most of the time do, that music died sometime in the late 80s.
Before that, I would say early 80s, I would think. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean,
popular music did. The truth is, through composed music, I don't know how modern classical music, there are very few composers right now. At the moment, there's some, like James Macmillan, still interests me quite a lot. But the 20th century was a great period for music in general, both high and low and everything in between. But the 21st century seems to be shaping up as something fairly disappointing on that score, So
there are a few popular artists today that I like, but I think on the whole, I don't find music as an industry exciting. the way that I do when I think about it in generations that preceded my birth, you know.
Well, the quality of musicianship was simply, there was a period when it was a revival of the blues. There were people who could play jazz chord progressions or who were imaginative in creating a sound that actually required a certain sophistication. In my experience, that's no longer the case. There was a golden age in which rock and roll became rock or whatever it was. I don't know that suddenly started attracting musicians of a very high caliber. In part because the Beatles made it respectable, not because they were virtuosi, but because they created fascinating chord progressions. Let me just put it that way. They set British folk melody to rock and roll beats and created sounds that people hadn't heard before. And all at once, it became clear that you could be creative, musically adventurous, and sophisticated, and still make a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the time of year where that's almost exclusively the music I'm listening to right now. Anyway, one of the nice things about getting hyper fixated on things.
You stick to popular music, do you?
Over summertime, I listen to exclusively classic rock. It's just it's a habit. It's
That's okay. I'm sorry. I'm the judge. I need a larger variety myself to get through the days. But yeah, I understand.
Yeah, it's something. I don't know. There's some quality of summertime in American music, or in American classic rock anyway, at least to me. Yeah, so let's talk about poiesis, creativity, poetics, poetry. And I've got Roland here, and I've got Kinagaya here, and I've got, I think the one that I grabbed off my shelf is Benner's selections from the Iliad here on my table. I just wanted to open with a quote that I thought you'd appreciate that I stumbled across. The Renaissance humanist Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in book 14 of his Genealogy of the Pagan Gods that poetry is, quote, a venerable branch of knowledge, succi plena, full of juice or ripe of promise for those who strive by the mental act of constructing fictions to give external expression to inner thoughts and feelings, that it is a kind of fervor for exquisitely crafting, then conveying in speech and writing whatever the mind has invented, a fervor which proceeds from the Spirit of God and is instilled, I think, in only a few minds. So I wanted to start by asking, you're a poet yourself. Roland is full of your poetry. And I hope...
Is it mine? Okay. There's
your
even
uncle's
in the
poetry.
latter part of the book, there's even poetry that's meant to be taken seriously, but
yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know, you have to be sort of the same way that like the slapstick comedy a la like Monty Python or Mel Brooks or Leslie Nielsen is good because they know the art, right? Like I feel like even the poetry in Roland, that you're very clear, like this is bad poetry, right? You have to understand the art to be able to do that. So I was wondering if we could begin from here.
The point is, you see, for those who haven't read the book, there's a fictional character, my great uncle Aloysius, whose life spans a period which he begins as a sort of post-pre-Raphaelite poet, like Ernest Dowson, or he's trying to imitate Haussmann, or but then he goes through a period of high modernism. There's even a few flirtations with a kind of psychedelically. But by the time he gets to the end, he's becoming more and more both a classicist, high modernist, and then the serious poetry begins writing, even when it's meant to be amusing, like the 14 pages of heroic couplets. Nonetheless, they are actually crafted. So for those, so yes, there is poetry that's intentionally imitative of a certain kind, someone who in his 20s wanted to be Swinburne, or Dowson, and then wanted in his 30s to be Iliad or Pound, or HD.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's
what
that.
could be Alexander Pope, so
Yeah. Yeah. And I think his kind of the progress of his corpus over the course of the book is it's almost like a crash course in kind of 20th century poetry itself, especially if if you're unfamiliar but interested in that kind of thing, read Roland and Moonlight. There you go. There's your first advertising plug for the day.
thank you.
So this is a very ancient idea from the Iliadic Homer's goddess to the Odyssean Homer's muse to Apollonius Rhodius beginning from Apollo. I wonder if we can talk about poetry as a kind of ecstasy or a sort of divine inspiration.
Enthusiasm. I mean, to use the terms in its proper sense, not just an ecstasy, not just an ecstatic thing, but also an inspiration and enthusiasm in which, something external enters into the poet. Just as, and I think you have to keep, I mean, I think there is both, in real poetry, I think there is both enthusiastic and ecstatic. I mean, I think, the oldest, the most primordial experience of poetry would have been at times inseparable from religious experience or shamanic experience in some cases for just that reason. And of course, that's why Plato, of course, sees a dangerous force of the daimonian irrational in poets, and while himself nonetheless being, albeit in the form of prose, quite a distinguished poet in his own right. What's interesting in the quote from Boccaccio, in fact, by the way, the Genealogy of the Gods is a delightful book. It's every bit as entertaining as the Decameron, if not as lewd. For those who require more buoyant Renaissance pornography, okay, then the Decameron is more fun. But the Genealogy of the Gods is a wonderful book. But you see there, there's still there's a kind of apologetic going on there, where he still feels at first to say that what makes poetry a respectable art is almost as if he's saying it functions allegorically. That is, that it's a way of expressing your thoughts in a more obliging, a more attractive way than you might otherwise do, and thereby communicating more. It's only at the end of that passage that you read, and I'm glad you kept going on, that his real claim begins to surface, which is that there's a divine inspiration. It's not merely a matter, the poetry is a particularly ornate and useful way of conveying ideas, like those who had to defend the use of imagery in worship as a book for the illiterate,
right,
rather than saying, well, no, the real purpose of the arts and worship is, I don't know, theurgic. I mean, it's actually to break down the division between our sensibility and the inpouring of what the divine communicates in the form of beauty. But Boccaccio there, is emblematic of that Renaissance move back toward that place where the arts, religious experience, magic in the good sense, magia, not goetia, and theurgy, and real spiritual experience, real revelation, are all intermingled in one. And that will be picked up, of course, again in the Romantic period, sometimes in a more immanentist, sometimes, which in that Plato's suspicion of the poets now becomes a high commendation. The language of the chain linking the soul of the poet to the divine, to an enthusiastic source. So source,
yeah,
enthusiasm. I'm not quite awake yet for some reason, so
that's perfectly okay. Plato thinks everything that's fun is a daimon. That's what I've done.
And of course he's right about that. It's just there's that streak, at least at that period in Plato, is that streak of austere rationalism that's afraid of the daimones. I think that actually is not as much the case when you get to the laws, for instance, or the late Plato. I mean, I think the late Plato we're already on the way to what we become middle and Neoplatonism. There's less of an anxiety about the heterogeneity of the divine in the later Plato.
Do you get the sense too for Boccaccio? This just occurred to me while you were talking. Do you think that there's something in his thought of like the imaginal realm, not directly derived from necessarily, but sort of in the same vein as like Ibn Arabi's Barzakh, like this concept of a metaphysical, the mundus imaginalis in Corbin?
Well, I think that's very much part of Renaissance Italian thought in general about the arts and philosophy and magic. Again, there was a revival of white magic. And I think Boccaccio, it was an extremely educated man, obviously, would definitely have been aware of and influenced by this sort of Florentine enthusiasm for the idea of if not, I mean, it would be quite like Ibn Arabi, but nonetheless an understanding that there's a realm of the imagination that coincides with the realm of forms, and that for that reason, for instance, a neuromancy, the reading of dreams makes sense because there's a primordial communion already between the highest levels of intellectus or nous, the highest levels of the soul, and the eternal realm there above. Both are contained within psyche. They're all Neoplatonists to a great degree, obviously, and with all the inflections you get from the Chaldean oracles and everything. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that Boccaccio definitely did think in those terms. I just felt what I found interesting was that you start with a kind of traditional scholastic defense of poetry as a sort of didactic or almost how can you put it? It's sort of an electuary, something sweet to make a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down.
Yeah.
A sugary electuary is so. Anyway, yes. So I've answered your question. I just keep re-answering it, so you can go on to the next one.
Yeah,
we're on the clock here, son.
Of course.
Yeah.
So when did you first read Homer? How's your relationship with Homer grown over time, over the years? Because Homer is like a big deal to your great uncle in Roland, and I mean, of course, like with your classical background, one has to assume.
I read, I'll tell you this. I'm trying to remember. I read Homer all the way through, both books and actually also the Homeric hymns in translation. Whereas I didn't read it through in Greek to begin with. But at the age of 11, I didn't have mastery of Homeric Greek. I just I had so I read. I would say probably 10 or 11. But I'll tell you that I'll confess that before that, as a young child, I had read the classic comics versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I was transfixed even then. But I probably didn't read the epics all in Greek all the way through till I was, I think, 19. So before just part, obviously, And in those days, I have to say, I still had the degenerate habit of pronouncing it all in the Erasmian fashion. So I probably, how it should be pronounced, I really don't know. But I'm now in the habit of using only demotic just as a default, because we know that demotic pronunciations, at least in late antiquity, had taken hold in many regards. So I figure if you travel in Greece, so you'll again and again be told, no, all the way back to Homeric times, this is how Greek was pronounced. It seems implausible, if only because as late as the 11th and 12th century, the ypsilon was being used to represent a U sound in Slavic, like it was with the Cyrillic alphabet. Yeah. But whatever, that's all rather recherche. But so for me, it was only thereafter that it became mininaído, and I have to admit, it flows more musically, more fluidly in a living tongue that actually has a music to it. I tell you, when I converted spiritually from Erasmian to demotic,
please,
it wasn't just to becoming Orthodox. It was I think 19, and I was in Greece. I was at Cambridge doing an MPhil, and 20. I was 20. I was in Greece, and there was an old bishop there who was sort of considered a holy man in Thessaloniki. We won't talk about it. Who was overwhelmed by the sight of my pale skin and blue eyes, which to many a Greek can give the impression of a kind of purity or innocence in a young face. I had a young face, and I was exquisitely beautiful, angelically. So you wouldn't know it now, but I mean, I was gorgeous, and my eyes were sapphire. But anyway, he took his eyes, and at one point he said, he said he had a weakness for me, and it was Adina Mia. And it occurred to me that Adina Mia, since we're speaking about poetry, in Erasmian would be Aduna Mia. And at that moment, I realized there's no way God ever allowed the Greek tongue to be spoken that way by living souls. Adina Mia, delta, soft, the ypsilon, So from that moment on, I resolved never again to pollute my mouth with Erasmian pronunciations. And it helps with reading Greek. I mean, I don't know. I tell you, you've read Homer in Greek, right? I mean,
Yeah, I was actually prouder when I was finishing my MA in religious studies. I did my thesis. I finished all my coursework. I was actually prouder of the fact that my Latin professor for my undergrad and I, through that whole 2 years, had been reading through the Iliad in Greek, and we finished right before I graduated. So,
but I mean, if you know how a demotic pronunciation sounds, read it aloud to yourself. Read passages, and you'll see what I mean. That all at once the flow, the sort of, there's a music there that is very different from the sort of the Homeric music you imagine as being more, thunderous. Let's put it that way. It's, you hear the lyricism and the lightness too. Ina papidon is ina papidon is oina pa pointon.
Yeah. I do that. I try to aim for a much more demotic pronunciation when I sing the Psalms. I've taken to when I'm better at keeping up with my rule of prayer than I have been recently. Again, having a 7-month-old is just a ton of fun. But
pray in Sanskrit, so I wouldn't know. So
yeah, I mean, I try to do the Psalms exclusively in Greek. I try to do everything in Greek as often as possible. It really just comes down to having
taxes. I should hope.
Yeah.
That confuses them, but I mean, it keeps them on their toes.
My kid does like Greek better than Latin, which makes me happy.
You see, the thing is, I've never had this prejudice one way or the other. It's like when people say, "Are you a dog person or a cat person?" I say, "Well, I've loved both in my life." And Greek and Latin are, they're very different languages, different music, and a different sense, and they create very different kinds of poetry. I mean, you couldn't have the kind, for sheer sonic splendor, Virgil, easily compares to any of the great Greek poets, but does it with a kind of controlled precision that's almost impossible, even in Hellen, in Greek of any kind. I mean, Greek is in some sense, a more elemental language, has a more complex and at least philologically, it retains aspects of its ancient forms well into the early Hellenistic period in a way that has been purged from Latin by the time we get to Augustan age poetry. But I mean, there's certain things that Latin poetry can do exquisitely well, the not so well in the Greek. I mean,
Yeah.
you get the lyricism of Theocritus. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's lovely. The Greek anthology is just full of these beautiful sort of aphoristic or lyric verses. But I mean, just take take Catullus. Okay, on the one hand, rude, a little bit blue by your but all right. Well, the most famous, of course, for us is the "Vivamus me lesbiatque memus, rumoresque senum sueriarm, omnes unius aestamemus assis." It says next lines: "Sones occidere redire possunt, nobis cum semel occidit brevis lux nox est perpetua una dormienda." So suns can rise, fall, and rise again. But for us, once that that brief light has set, there is one perpetual night that must be slept. Didn't mean that. I was trying to avoid the rhyme there, but I'm afraid there it's hard to. You get something there that it's just not. It's native to the Latin tongue in that it has the kind of pathos and wit, sort of aphoristic elegance, and then it can pass back and forth between the witty and the morose and and those gorgeous lines. But it's a funny poem, basically. It's just "Dami vasi Amelia, Dein alter," just kiss me, kiss me, kiss me. I mean, it's so. I think every language has its genius, and I would be. I've gotten as much pleasure from Latin verse as Greek in my life. So.
Yeah, and I don't, I'm not trashing Latin. My new job is actually teaching Latin. I was going to say, when you mentioned Theocritus, I mean, I actually like the eclogues much better than the edils.
Right.
Eclogue 1 is possibly, it's up there with my favorite Latin poetry. I also like Ovid's take on Orpheus and Eurydice.
Well, again, I mean, I'm a great Ovid fanatic, which might be one of the reasons why I won't give one tradition primacy over the other. I mean, I think they're just moments of exquisite delicacy and brilliance in Ovid. Again, with that, Augustan age taste for the lubricious, the salacious, but at the same time very beautiful. And he had a genius for capturing. I mean, he does it in two places, both in the Metamorpho. What is it in two places? Yeah, twice. When he talks about the rape of Eurydice, it's very touching because he emphasized she's very, very young. And when she's raped, she's been gathering flowers, and she loses the flowers. And she grieves as much for the loss. So the imagery is defloration. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, it captures her innocence. She grieves. She doesn't know what's really happened. She grieves as much for the flowers losing the flowers she plucked as being, as losing her maidenhead to this to Hades. And I remember reading that at the age of 16 and just being impressed by first of all, the delicacy of the image, but also how brilliantly it captured the innocence of a young girl, despoiled in a way that it kind of grabs you. You feel this deep pity at the same time that you're admiring the poetic deftness of the one image implying the other.
Yeah.
So Ovid was a genius, isn't it?
Yeah. The passage in Orpheus, or the passage in Ovid about Orpheus, I think what I like better about Ovid's take in book 10 of Metamorphoses than Virgil's take in book 4 of the Georgics is that, and I think Charles Segal was the one who argued this, that like Virgil's Orpheus is guilty of like transgressing the natural order, right? Like the point of that story is that no, like death, rebirth, the cycle of nature, you can't,
Right.
Orpheus has done bad. But in Ovid, it's clear that, Ovid thinks death is nonsense. He's like, no, yeah, like Orpheus's main problem was just that he couldn't follow through on it, right?
Oh yeah, and Ovid takes Orpheus much more as sort of the divine exemplar of the true poet, the one who will penetrate to the, and of course, then his dissevered head begins to, becomes a source of oracular wisdom, because this is continuous with after the Maenads do him in.
Yeah,
there's such a pain.
Yeah,
I've had so much trouble with those girls. I'm telling you. Sorry. I know. Gods of ecstasy and madness have this effect on people. Elvis did it to a lot of girls too. So did the Beatles, Frank Sinatra. All those Dionysian figures. But
yeah, it's they're as early as Orpheus. There's something to poetry about that, right? Well, and his severed speaking head winds up on the Isle of Lesbos, right? Which is where, of course, we get Sappho and Alcyone, I think, is also a lesbian poet. I don't think Archilochus is, right? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. That doesn't sound right.
No, I don't think Archilochus is, but you get this tradition coming out of there, and I think it's people maybe don't understand who haven't read the classics that on the one hand, yes, you're reading a foreign world from the past, right? But on the other hand, there's something immediately kind of connective and intimate about reading these authors, especially if you can read them in their original languages, like Sappho's 31st fragment, where she talks about how, she's seeing the girl and it's either a girl that she's in love with, or it's a girl that she's sort of been the governess to, who she's trying to marry off to someone, or both, right?
It's impossible to tell what it is.
Yeah, I mean, but like even, whatever the case may be, when she talks about how like fire runs under her skin, right? And her skin is turning green with envy. And it's like, yes, I get that. I understand, I've had that feeling before. This is what, like in Sanskrit, we might call kama, right? Like pleasure in reading. So I would ask then, for you, talking specifically about ancient poetry, where have you found the most kama? Where have you found the most sort of both pleasure and sense of like
in ancient poetry? We're sticking with the classics for now.
Just for right now. Yeah, we will eventually move forward.
The Iliad, when we're talking on a big scale, the Iliad. And as I've already said, I have a special love of Ovid. I love Theocritus, but actually, come to think, one of the if we can move a little bit further forward in time, Statius actually gives me a great deal of, I share Dante's admiration for the plain, sweet style of Statius rather, and the scene painting. He had a genius for nature poetry, for instance, in a way that I'm losing. I'm losing it for some reason. I can't call a name to mind. Very obvious name. But anyway, yeah. But I don't know. It's if we're talking about Greek and Latin specifically, that would be. I would say that the Iliad, more so than, I mean, as much as everyone loves the Odyssey, and of course you can, I love it, but the Iliad hypnotized me when I was young. The death of, in a sense, it's a tragedy. It builds up to the death of Hector. Now, even when the death of Hector comes, it has some absurd moments in it. In the sense, Hector seeing Achilles and fleeing and being chased all around the walls of Troy. But I don't really think that should be seen as. I mean, you realize that there's something touching. You see far greater humanity in Hector than in any of the Greeks, right? I mean, there's one of the surprising things about the Iliad is that the Trojans, Priam too, you see a sort of tender regard for them and a pity for them that isn't at all mitigated by the clear favoritism of the poet on the side of the Greeks. The Trojans are still these strange and dangerous Orientals. Priam has an endless number of sons, presumably because he has an endless number of what they do things very strangely there, and of course. You shouldn't be stealing a Spartan queen, I mean, it's just not done, and so, of course, he's on the side of the Greeks, and yet that in no way, just as Euripides, portrays the Persians with full sympathy, and Hector is the most moving figure, obviously, and at the end, when suddenly he realizes that he's confronting not just an enemy, but absolutely inexorable death, that there's no way that he can defeat this monster of a man. And fleeing actually there's a great touch of humanity there, because he has to gather himself and turn to fight, And I remember, and of course, I mean, the sheer, the way in which the violence, force, I mean, Simone May's essay on this is brilliant. The way force and violence are captured in the Iliad and controlled and channeled into this ever great. You think after you've seen so much carnage in the course of the poem, like Diomedes, his day of glory and all that when Achilles finally takes to the battlefield, you can't really exceed the effect, and yet it does. I mean, magnificently. You suddenly realize that this is a completely different magnitude of power and violence and rage, something that's so uncontrollable that it's like a dark divine force. There's no one can defeat Achilles.
Well, and he steps out before he even rejoins.
Even the river cannot defend. You stop him. Yeah.
Well, but before he even rejoins the fight, right? He walks out. Athena has clothed him with the aegis or the aegis of Zeus, and he lets out the war cry, and 12 of the Trojans die out of sheer panic right on the spot. The rest of them run away, right? No, I totally, to your point about Hector being the most easily sympathetic character of the Iliad. And also, I think...
And also, of course, I mean, you see him, as you can't with any of the Greek heroes, you see him in the ecos. You see him in the household as a father and a husband and a defender of his own city, and all these things he's portrayed with, and I mean, and again, there are brilliant touches like his little son being scared at the sight of the great bristles on the helmet. I mean, these are magnificent. And so the Iliad had an effect on me that was extraordinary. I think when I was young, I mean, it was just this extraordinary orchestration of everything to that final confrontation, and then the perfect coda of Priam coming to the tent of Achilles through the encampments of the Greeks, and Achilles weeping for the thought of his own aged father soon to die. It really is. It is. By the way, did you ever see that film Troy?
With Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This to me tells me something about Hollywood. For 2.5 millennia, it's been generally acknowledged that there's probably no more gripping and entertaining story than the Iliad as it's told. Only in Hollywood then would it just, the first thing is, oh, we've got to fix this, you know. The stupid ending of the film, which they're not even faithful to Quintus of Smyrna,
Yeah, it's the better rendition I've seen of the Iliad on screen. Netflix did a show a couple of years ago, I think. Troy, Fall of a City was its name, and the one immediate hook that they had for me that they did better than the movie Troy is that the gods are characters in the show.
Right.
That was my immediate complaint as a kid. The first time I saw Troy.
Well, the thing is a demythologized Iliad doesn't really leave you with much of a story, right? I mean,
what's the point?
You're in a world where the partition between the divine and the human simply isn't there, in which there's an immediate communication with daimonian or divine or supernatural forces. And the characters themselves are partly free, but also partly embodiments of these forces that exceed them. If you don't understand that, then the poem sort of lacks any point other than, well, here's a story of how, Fort Troy fell to the Visigoths or whatever.
Well, and when you sort of cast all of that too in the wider mythologic of the epic cycle, right? Where like, what's the point of these stories? This is Zeus is trying to kill off all the heroes, right? Like we're actually coming to the end of that age of divine and human and magical kind of all intermixing so easily.
It's definitely something that represents a kind of threshold. I'm not talking like Julian Jaynes here, in which the causeway suddenly is established between the hemispheres, and until then, the people have no consciousness of themselves. And Julian Jaynes was once asked just how conscious was the fully integrated bicameral mind. So no more than a table.
Okay.
By the way, this is where a little bit I'm not into disenchantment in general, but this is one point that a Marxist might make. Is that and Julian Jaynes says, well, you see, go back to the Gilgamesh epic or earlier, and there's not a lot of psychological matter that's suggesting self-consciousness. You want to point out to him that, of course, movable type didn't exist. There was no such thing as paper, especially when you're about Gilgamesh, where you're talking about an epic written in cuneiform on clay tablets. Material conditions actually determined cultural production. So, no, it's true. The 19th century novel was not invented 2,000 years before Christ, and there's a reason for that. You actually, there was no material means for doing so. Anyway, that's a different matter.
I also somewhat suspect about Gilgamesh. I'm thinking about this because I actually just wrapped up the year at my previous job, and I do a mythology unit with my sixth graders where we read, among other things, Enuma and Gilgamesh and, probably things that other sixth graders aren't reading, but we had fun with it. And one of the things we talked about.
You're a hero of the human spirit. I went to a ridiculously good public school, ridiculously ambitious and experimental during a golden period. So, yeah, we got all of that in elementary school. But right now, you're lucky if you get out of high school having even heard of Homer.
Well, you'll like this. You'll like this then. So we read Gilgamesh, and we talked a little bit because there's all this stuff in Gilgamesh about like a New Year festival that they keep coming back to in certain of the tablets. So I made the suggestion to the students. I was like, look, I don't know for sure, but this kind of makes me think that this is the sort of story that they're reciting every year at a feast. And maybe there's some kind of theater that's going on while this is being recounted. So you're not, most people can't read. You're not just like listening to someone drone. You're also watching something happen.
It's a rhapsode and a drama, or,
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing also when you talk about how these were delivered, how you withdraw them again, material conditions, cultural conditions, we approach ancient verse as verse on the page. And we read it the way we would read Wallace Stevens. We don't even. Now, I'll say this is a good thing. This, from an early age, I started like memorizing vast amounts of verse and committing it to memory, right? Just because as a kid, I thought that was a cool thing to do. But the good thing about that is you begin to separate the experience of poetry as something spoken and heard from something read, and it's a very different thing. In the ancient world, obviously, most reading was listening, and most listening outside of certain contexts, when it was a corporate or a public thing, was attached to spectacle, to theama, to looking at. I mean, even to this day, if you're in, say, Burma or Thailand, and there's a public, in certain parts, say the Ramakian or stories from the Ramayana in their Indo-Chinese versions, they'll be illustrated with shadow puppets or things. I mean, so that there's more than just the words. There are actually actions, gestures, images that are also communicating the story, and including, in the case of actors, expression, sometimes masks, sometimes stylized forms of expression.
So I would have them, to that point, I would have them, like, whenever Humbaba would be part of the text, and I would read the name Humbaba, I would have them all go like, Humbaba, right? Like try to get some sense of like, it's a horrible monster.
That it's easy to do, though. I mean, that name just cries out to be cried out, you know?
Yeah. And they're used to it from, Purim spiels and things like that. But the end of the assignment was, so we read Gilgamesh, and I had constructed this mythology unit to talk about like origins and cosmology and gods and heroes, humans and ends. So Gilgamesh we read with humans, and then we compared and contrasted it with an episode of Star Trek. So I had them watch Star Trek, the original series, the one where they find Apollo, and they had to fill out like a whole worksheet and talk to me about like, so these are very different images of what humanity is and is going to become. And,
because I'm of a certain age, I not only know the episode, I could probably quote scenes from it. It's just that. And do you know that the network made them cut out the original ending of the story? Because in the original story, the female lead in that story is actually pregnant at the end with Apollo's baby, and the network made them cut that out. So
that's like a way better ending.
How do you raise an infant god is the last line in the original script. But James Blish restored it in the version that he wrote when he did the story versions of it. So that's a memory from the deep past. Yeah. So I mean, this is I don't know. I mean, Yeats used to make the point quite a lot when he talked about especially in his early days. I mean, of course, there are three Yeats. Yeats, in poetic terms, is the early sort of pre-Raphaelite Yeats, who's writing not only Irish mythology but is fascinated with Indian metaphysics. There's the mid-period where he's kind of working it out, where between lyrical descriptions and a more nationalist, so culminating in some very powerful verse like Easter 1916, and then there's the high modernist Yeats of the late books, who just a poet from a different universe. I mean, it's just completely. He believed that there was a bardic way early on the Yeats. Part of this is the pretensions, the Celtic Twilight stuff and all that, but there was a bardic way of delivering verse that was the only proper way. And if you ever listen to recordings of him, he's singing. He does this sort of sing. So, I will arise and go down and go to Innisfree, or and that he always wanted to unite verse to dramaturgy for just that reason, because not just because of how it communicates meaning. It wasn't for him an instrumental thing. It was because he believed there was this way in which the poetry is a more immediate communication of truths that surpass the calculating intellect's ability to arrange reality and represent it. He was very much, and that the world as we tend to see it in our more prosaic consciousness is a posterior construction of a reality that in its immediacy reveals more by actually incorporating us into its own knowledge of itself, right?
Yeah.
There's sort of also kind of, though he wouldn't have known it, there's kind of, it wouldn't have occurred. So it's like Whitehead in Process and Reality, whatever you think of, where he says, the way we conceive of time and space is, matter is a perpetual present. It's just its entirety is in itself. Time doesn't, and consciousness is entirely temporal. It can't be, has to be, but in fact that beneath, and so we create a spatialized reality that we think is the original reality, from which then come, to which are superadded then the secondary qualities, and then the tertiary qualities of emotional response, where he said this is actually backwards. A real experience, this sort of vibratory experience, which is neither space nor time, but which is, emotional in a sense, but prior to reflective consciousness, is the real structure of reality. That reality is experience, which is then laterally, all right, that's a different matter.
Well,
but there's an insight there in that whether you take Whitehead's approach to it or not, is that much of what we think we experience directly, and I'm not talking about representationalism. I mean, what we think of as direct experience, we already realize is a reaction to an experience that's more primordial in us, not just, I don't mean just more primordial and in some transcendent sense. And I do think it's true that the arts are infinitely more important than philosophy. I mean, and more important in the most crucial ways than much of than the sciences as we've created them. But because it actually does, in fact, bring us nearer the source. What then is necessary? Why the role that philosophy and the sciences are hermeneutical. And when they forget that they're hermeneutical and become absolute discourses, that's when they're dangerous. But when they remember that they're interpretive discourses about an experience that can't be reduced to pure calculation or pure speculation, but that requires both, and that the actual experience itself is more original and can be pointed to, I think, reconstructed phenomenologically, then you find yourself in the realm of the arts again, of myth and poetry, of handicraft, images, and you realize that you already understood, that in that realm things can be understood, in a very different way, but in a way that actually, on the one hand, it can be communicated to more persons, and on the other hand, it can be a more rarefied experience than most of us ever achieve in ordinary life. That it brings us closer to a knowledge that's available by no other means, and that is a truer glimpse of reality than what we think of as our rational discourses.
Yeah, it sounds very similar, and I want to point towards this poetic tradition for a minute, because I know it's special to you the way it's special to me as well. But it sounds sort of similar to something Kena Upanishad says. I think it's Kena, might be Isha, where I think the line goes something like, I'm going to butcher the line. The essence of the line is that the way of knowledge is basically inferior to the way of devotion. There's something said about how those who try to follow the way of knowledge end up accruing something negative for themselves. It's in the midst of a larger context about wonder. I really should have had it with me.
It's got to be the Cana, right? Because the Isha doesn't have room for that whole sentence in it. I mean,
yeah, I think it's the Cana. I believe it's the Cana.
No, I mean, and of course, this isn't to demote. It's simply a matter of priority, knowing that I mean, and many great scientists of our age, of the last century, said as much. Max Planck was very clear about this. Is that what the sciences are doing is constructing an interpretive discourse that can only be understood in its original as having an origin in a kind of infinite act of mind where the knowing and the known are one. And he was perfectly willing to think in terms of there are religious experiences that bring you to that place of coincidence. But what the sciences are doing, what philosophy are doing, is a necessary speculative recuperation of the knowledge. But the moment, again, knowing what is absolute and what isn't, is all the essence of wisdom. You can end up like this tedious, like Richard Dawkins, who thinks that you have this already discredited genetocentric theory that somehow that explains everything. He literally says the mystery of existence was solved by Charles Darwin. I can't imagine Darwin thinking that he'd solved the mystery of existence, but he came from an earlier age when they used words more precisely. At the moment you do that, you make a joke of the sciences, because then you're turning them into a kind of puppet play, something you're trivializing what science actually does. But anyway, I know why I'm drifting off in this direction. It was just that I always thought that Yeats was on to something. I don't know if I would recommend attempting his bardic intonations. They sound a bit twee, but the sense that you should. I would say if you love poetry, memorize poetry. It's something you have to do early in life, I'm afraid. If you don't cultivate the habit early in life, then later in life you just can't do it. But memorize the verse, speak it aloud. Try to incorporate it into yourself and yourself into it, and you find that this is more than a diversion.
Yeah, well, and as you were speaking,
of course, I was drove my son mad just a few weeks ago. We were in Ireland, right? Yeah. And everywhere we went, I was quoting like every bit of Yeats I could remember. Wandering through a forest, and suddenly the song of Wandering Angus, and I thought he was going to strangle me by the end. But you just have to do it. You're walking in a forest in the Ring of Kerry.
Yeah.
What are the first words that occur to you? I went into a hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and stripped a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor and gone to blow the fire aflame, something rustled by the door and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and fled and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I'll seek her out where she is gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk among long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. See, Oh, it's
Yeah.
much better than just reading it on the page.
Yeah. How can you not recite that if you're actually walking in an Irish wood, right?
Well, I mean, he by the end, I think he'd gotten used to he was reading a lot of Yeats there himself. We actually had I think the last night in the cottage by we had this lovely cottage by the Ballion Bay, Skellig Bay, and we read out Cuchulain's Fight with the Sea. So,
well, I had a chance to hear. I thought of you actually recently when this happened. So I had a friend come to visit St. Louis who also has a graduate background in religious studies who had never been to a Hindu temple. So I was like, let's go to the temple. And it just so happened as we were going that it was Maha Kumbhabhishekam, their like once every 12 years temple renewal festival.
I was about to say, yeah. That's not a yearly thing at all.
It was a profound felicity because I had no idea it was happening, but it was like a 5-day festival. And when we went there were priests outside performing Vedic yajnas, and I'm sure that I mispronounced that just now. My Sanskrit's terrible, but performing Vedic fire sacrifices and actually like chanting the Vedas into microphones. And I was just standing there and I was like I've read Rig Veda. I know, I know what's in these texts. Where else would I have ever heard what this actually sounds like, what it actually looks like, frankly, what it actually like smells like,
Yeah.
It was so great. But
it is a problem. I mean, we do this is just a reality of the modern world, is that it's not just everything, all the arts come to us as private experiences. Let's admit it, I'm a dilettante because that's what my age allows me to be. If I, am so strange as to enjoy reading poetry for pleasure. There are no, I mean, okay, all right, there are liturgies and things like that which repeat and that, that have a certain poetic canon of their own. If when you were Orthodox, the Akathistos Hymnos is quite gorgeous stuff, and you live in it. But on the whole, the culture as a whole has reduced the experience. I mean, we're a Banazic, we're a mechanized, we're a mercantile culture, we're a culture of individualism. There's no such thing as a public festivity of the arts that actually enact. It's public readings. Okay. Again, a few dilettantes go to the library to hear an aging beat poet, rasping out second-rate verse from, All right, but, when I've had these debates, for instance, I had these theological debates about the nature of tragedy or how to read tragedy with Rowan Williams and others. Most of our debates tend to be confined to the text on the page. Now, my claim is that this is a problem. Maybe Rowan would agree. Because we seem to be unable to communicate with one another on this issue. But, he's from this D.M. McKinnon tradition. You read the tragedy and you read the gospel in the light of tragedy and all that. Which is problematic for me. But it is rare. I noticed that for either of us, it's rare to put the we're talking about, because we're talking about Attic tragedy, not just tragedy in general. That's that too. But it was specifically is the Attic tragedy is not, it wasn't something that the dilettantes or the wealthy people who made contributions to endowments for the arts or anything went occasionally, or going to the Met to see an opera. It was a public festival. Specifically, the Dionysia has specific religious meaning. It has specific apotropaic religious meaning on the one hand. It was an attempt to control and fend off the more violent aspects of the Dionysian in religious and artistic experience by creating a kind of a compromise, a kind of accommodation within the festal cycle and within artistic form. I think Nietzsche was right about this. I mean, the young Nietzsche went a bit overboard with some of the sort of proto-Hegelianizing, but anyway, or I should say diluted Hegelianism. But the meaning of the tragedies had much to do with the whole several-day feast and how they were performed together, always as a trilogy, followed by then a satyr play, which again is a kind of civic accommodation. You're kind of mediating the tragedy back into everyday life by giving it a comic twist at the end that makes it possible to bear. Yeah. All that's it. That's not how we experience the arts. It is very much now for us. It is, it's an individual experience or a shared individual experience, if you know what I mean. We're all going there as spectators, but we're not living within that festal or that daimonian experience. And I don't know if we can ever really fully understand what it is we've lost in that regard.
Yeah, like there's something missing, for example, like in Plautus's Amphitero, when Mercury comes out in the prologue and says that it's going to be a tragedy because it's a story about gods and heroes and whatever, and presumably the crowd boos in between that line and the next one where he says, "What, you don't want a tragedy? Well, don't worry about it. I'm a god. I'll just change it into a comedy, keeping all the same words," right? Like,
now, of course, even at that point, we're arriving at the Roman sort of urbane irony as opposed to a genuine civic festival. There, we're already, but again, that's within the context of a wider cultic existence or a wider cultural existence that we don't now have. And I mean, it's not like something we can recover. You can't, I mean, certain facts, again, material conditions do determine cultural production, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. And, as well as I do, attempts to just sort of, I mean, there's no just like simply going back to the past.
And on the other hand, remember also that the individual delectation is itself maybe a new experience that was missing, in much of the ancient world. We shouldn't necessarily. I mean, it's not something to be despised because it's different, but it is different.
Yeah, I'm reminded the way you just put that of, and Mark Vernon wrote a book about this, about Owen Barfield's concept of the evolution of consciousness from that kind of...
It starts from original participation, and then there's an estrangement and an alienation that allows for a more reflective return to final participation. And I mean, it's just we throughout most of the past history, it's assumed that when we look out on the natural world or when we encounter the world outside ourselves, something is always looking back, right? The world hasn't been reduced to mere material quantity. I mean, this is also very sort of Heideggerian notion that, the world that was, I mean, I hate bringing up Heidegger because, there's an obvious black mark on his record there, but, the world that was the place that allowed for gods and mortals to meet, heaven and earth to coincide. It had opened the space for the temple so the gods could show themselves and we could be seen by the gods and all that. That way of approaching being is gone, and instead we're in the age of the Gestalt, the framing in which all of material nature is reduced to standing reserve to something dead, intrinsically dead. In fact, that's what the philosophy of mechanism is that the world is the illusion of life because of the exquisite complexity of the mechanical arrangement of a reality that's intrinsically dead. It's the exact inverse of it. Now, with Owen Barfield, of course, though, there's this kind of happy story that, that this allows us, after making the mistake of the estrangement becoming like this, an antinomy, a reconciliation through progress in science and philosophy and spiritual experience that allows us more deeply to realize that our communion is real. That it's not something alien to ourselves and all that. My suspicion, of course, is that that's a lot of hopeful thinking, that in fact the estrangement is a permanent one that will lead to what even at his time Owen Barfield couldn't be quite as conscious of, was just the sheer devastation of the environmental crisis that follows from that vision of things.
Yeah. The 20th century. Oh, go ahead.
No, go on. You're right.
I was just going to say the 20th century thinker that I've spent a lot of time with in the last year, who I think also belongs in that conversation, and together with the earlier conversation about the imaginal world, would actually be Carl Jung, who I think Jung makes the mistake of trying to insist that what I'm going to call his philosophy of the psyche is an empirical science rather than a metaphysics. If you treat it like a metaphysics, it works a lot better than if you treat it like an empirical science, I think.
Or if you ignore it altogether, it works best of all. But that's all right. The thing of Jung is I keep trying to see what, it's like when people try to get me interested in certain kinds of hermeticists. You've really got to read Valentin Tomberg. It's so profound. And I fall asleep. I find that there's a sort of arbitrariness in assigning meanings to images that you've elected. I tend to see it as something very with Jung. You'll encounter insights, but you'll also encounter a great deal of he's imposing his own. And he has every right to do this, as you say, his own metaphysics on the data.
Yeah, there are lots of fair critiques. For me, I think, the reason I've been engaging with him is because I found him therapeutic. Like I've been seeing an analyst in his tradition for almost a year or so, which has been helpful for me. But I think it's like. And this is a lesson that I think is useful for almost all, like a lot of the 20th century writers in philosophy and spirituality and religion and whatever, so long as you don't kind of deify their system as like,
he is right. To me, it seems like he's self-evidently right about archetypes, not how he interprets them, not even the ones he necessarily isolates. But that consciousness works in this way, that we are irreducibly mythopoetic, because what we are also emanates from a realm of the imaginal. Just as Freud is undeniably right that there is something like a realm of the unconscious where certain repressed or things that have been hidden from the conscious mind are kept hidden unless brought to light. But that doesn't mean that Freud got right or that Jung's reading of these archetypes. So the insights I'm all for celebrating and not ridiculing, as people who attack Freud with good reason for the really silly things in Freud. Surgery on the nose can relieve certain psychological problems. That stuff.
Yeah.
But this, the notion that there's a realm of the unconscious, and it is both more basic, more fundamental, even more primal than ordinary everyday consciousness, and also, and he himself didn't appreciate this nearly as well, also much more exalted, higher, more radiant, more luminous than everyday consciousness. The latter, though, there are plenty of Indian and Greek and Christian and Jewish and Muslim and mystics who already knew that, that the conscious mind is just one area of one clearing within a continuum that's both much more, that goes down into much deeper depths and rises into much more radiant heights than we're usually aware.
Yeah. Well, and Jung never got around. Jung talks frequently in his works about, like, he basically says over and over again, I need to study Vedanta. I need to study Vedanta. Like, I hear that, Vedanta has a lot to do with this, etc. I don't think he ever got around to it. But I think the point, right, follows that,
is I just tried to read those eight sermons to the day. And I know that's an early work. Whenever he talked about Gnosticism, he got it so, it just gets so boring, and so he gets it so colossally wrong. I wrote an essay on his Red Book when it came out. I don't know if you ever saw it, but
I don't think so. I'll have to find
it
out.
was, let's just say it was a mixed verdict on my part. I am. So anyway, yes, it's almost time that we were parting.
Yeah.
So throw in something about my books so that I can justify the time spent here. Let's see.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, sorry to get off on those tangents, but so in Roland,
go off on those tangents, let's say.
In Roland, great uncle Aloysius, right? Aloysius, okay. Great uncle Aloysius. One of the reasons that he turns to poetry, as well as one of the reasons he turns to neo-paganism, is this sense that's developed throughout the book that the vibrantly alive world of paganism, and especially of classical poetry, is metaphysically and morally superior to the dead world of, like, Christian modernism,
or post-Christian, or post-Christian,
post-Christian modernism. Yeah, however you want to phrase it.
Right.
And for a lot of people today, poetry is kind of a more sacramental experience than the empty ritualism of many Christian communities or confessions or crudities. I was wondering if to talk about Roland, like, and to kind of, if I want to be respectful of your time, but just how do we use poetry? How do we use poetics to, if re-enchant is the wrong word, then how do we use poetry to sort of, like, retrain our minds away from that modernism and into a more sort of spiritual vision of the universe? I'm rewording a question that I wrote that doesn't make sense the way that I wrote it now. So sorry if that's a little rambling.
No. I think you're actually, it more or less answers itself. I don't know what else to say except to sort of cultivate, to recognize that the realm of the arts is not a realm of entertainment and diversion alone. And it's certainly not, and it certainly shouldn't be optional. Our schooling, for instance, when it amazes me now. The difference, even in my lifetime when I was a kid, again, as I say, I was incredibly fortunate in going to a remarkably ambitious schooling system that did not hold up because it left too many people behind. So ultimately, after my time, they had to abandon a lot of those ambitions. But I got on famously there. I was very happy. But schooling now, to the degree that we school at all, but even in the university level, the degree to which now the emphasis is on productivity, business, coding, skills. Now, people need jobs. I understand that. But childhood comes once, then everything's downhill, And if you don't take that time, there's certain things you can do as a child, like learn languages. Well, that's the best time. So frankly, we should be flooding small children with languages. You get a little child from nursery school onward, who's exposed not only to her own or his own language, but another or several. Naturally fluent, no problem. The same is true with this, the imagination. It's either the imagination as being more than just an escape, but actually being a vital faculty for being able to grasp the fullness and depth of reality, rather before you try to break it up into small areas of concentration that, on the one hand, dissemble or belie the whole, but on the other, allow you to manipulate. And now you need that reflective and calculative intellect trained too. Mm-hmm. But if that's all that's ever trained, or worse than that, if just a purely practical intellect, that measures everything in terms of profit or production, productiveness, or then you've essentially suffocated the spirit at an early age. It's very hard to revive it again. It's very hard to train a mind that's been closed off from that reality to see it. I think that's why, there was such, the last great breath of a sort of romantic rebellion against the machine in living memory, of course, it came in the 60s. For whatever else, good and bad, you think about it. But I mean, the resort to Eastern mysticism and psychedelics was a spiritual yearning to reawaken that capacity that a mechanized, capitalized, economized, technologized culture has done so much to suppress and even kill. When Heidegger talks about the age of technology, it's not technique as such that's bad. It's not the human capacity to use ordered force against disordered force, is how I think I put it that way when I wrote something on Peter Sloterdijk. In itself is good, unless it's been detached from a capacity for spiritual wisdom, spiritual reverence before the mystery of the world that you're engaging with. Then technology just becomes exploitation, and exploitation is inevitably irreversible destruction.
Well, and to your point,
I mean, I don't know how to, I guess you start in the level of schools, but then where do you find the teachers who can do this? Because they're too products of their time. I mean, you become quite a fatalist. You start hoping that, maybe the whole system will collapse in time for us to recover our humanity from the ruins, even if only in part. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about,
hey, that's how Kenegaians just tear the whole damn thing down.
Yeah. I was gonna, Michael's classical education clearly serves him very well in Kenogaya, but it's pedagogy for being able to transcend the entire world order, right? It's like, eventually leaving behind the whole world described by that. Of course, the good parts of it come into the real world, as you described. But yeah, well, I want to be respectful of your time, and as always, I hope you'll do this again. But yeah, no, I mean, I look, Dave, let me just I like the fact that we have conversations. So I don't feel like I'm being interrogated only by us. And this is to say nothing against other interviewers, but as I think I said once before, every once in a while remember that you actually know things. That's good. Next time, we could have connected this whole dramaturgy question of how the poet to no drama and kabuki, and how in Japanese culture they attempted to rescue that sense of the performative in the arts and did so much more effectively for a time. Well, but you didn't go there for some reason. I don't know what's wrong with you. So maybe some future date. Maybe some future date. Originally when I conceived of this conversation, I was like, we can talk about the Beatles or baseball. And then I realized I have nothing important to say about baseball, and I wouldn't want to insult your great love of the sport by having nothing significant to say about it. So,
Although, point of baseball, I'll just say this: reaches back into and experience the civic festivity in a way that not all sports that we play now do. I mean, sport in general is is an honorable and good thing, but the sort of the pastoral so is healthier than, say, the NFL, which is let's be honest, much more of a machine vision of human play. It's a much more, for as impressive as it is. America has created some very complicated sporting tradition. The NFL, you have to be rather bright to figure out how to play this game. But I think in the end, it is not as flowing and poetical and mythically stirring as baseball is. You don't have the lone hero with the bat or on the mound confronting the abyss of the outfield. There aren't those moments of poignancy. You just have violence and speed, and you're trying to see which of the two machines is more effective than the other. It's a somewhat more degraded notion of sport.
Now, I do like soccer, and soccer, I would say, is violence.
Soccer flows. It's, I can't really enjoy it because, it's soccer, but I understand why people enjoy it. As they do basketball, there is a flow and a rhythm and a grace to it. And speed isn't simply velocity. It's also dance and nimbleness and, so.
Yeah. Well, I will see you next time then. And
yes.
Yeah, I'll send you a list of options for you to pick from. Or if you think of something, you let me know. As I'm sure you will.
I think it's well past the time we discussed the history of counterpoint.
The history of
counterpoint.
Okay.
Listening. I think this is something you want to study, so you can talk to me about it.
Okay.
That's just a guess. All right. Well, take care. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
Have a good summer.
Yeah, and to you. And happy recent Pentecost. So, see you.
Bye.